Hey everyone, and welcome. Thanks to LitRPG Reads for having us back.
Yeah,
Paul Bello, fine fellow.
absolutely.
So I had this moment in our last game where one of my players made a deal with this shadowy merchant guild, and it really threw the campaign for a loop.
Oh wow.
So it really made me think about how important factions can be.
Oh yeah.
And how much they can add to the game.
Absolutely.
So we're diving deep into factions today.
Yeah, that sounds fun.
How to make them matter. How to use them, whether you're a player or a DM.
I think that's something that every D&D player and DM can relate to. It's like that moment when you realize that the factions aren't just set dressing.
Right.
They have their own agendas and they're going to react to what you do.
Yeah, and that's what this LitRPG Reads article really hits on. The factions are more than just window dressing. Like they say, they're like gears in a clockwork machine driving the story forward.
That's a great analogy.
Causing conflicts.
Yeah.
Opening opportunities for the players.
Yeah. It's fantastic.
And the article does a great job of pointing out how they can impact the whole world.
Oh, yeah.
The alignment of the world, the resources, moral dilemmas that the players have to face.
Yeah, like the article talks about how you could have a mage guild that controls who even gets to be a wizard.
Oh, right.
In the world. And
it raises the stakes right away.
Yeah, instantly it's oh wow, I can't just decide to be a wizard. I have to deal with this guild.
Yeah.
And they give other examples like noble house politics.
Oh yeah, like Game of Thrones but with magic?
Exactly. It's Game of Thrones with more magic missiles.
Yeah, it's that feeling that the setting is lived in.
Right.
That it has a history, a future that's being shaped, and not just by the DM, but by all these factions with their own goals.
Exactly. And, I know some folks are probably thinking oh, my campaign is small scale. Do I really need all this?
Right.
But the article makes a really good point that even on a small scale, that
factions add so much spice.
Yeah.
They're not the main course, but they add a lot of flavor.
Yeah. And, DMs are busy.
Yeah.
They don't have time to create these massive sprawling things.
Right.
You can give these factions a nudge every now and again, and they kind of take on life of their own.
That's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, let's talk about types of factions, because the article has a good list. Yeah. But I feel like we could go even further. We could take the classic Thieves Guild.
Right.
But instead of just Thieves Guild, we tie it to the Zentrum.
Oh, yeah.
Or we take noble houses, but we say it's a specific infamous family, like the Castlanters.
Right.
Really give it that D&D.
Exactly. You got to give each faction its own distinct personality. It's not just what they want, it's their culture, their resources, their leaders. All these details make them unique.
Yes. And the article talks about building effective factions. And they talk a lot about resources.
Yeah.
And I think that's super important. They have to have a way to get what they want. Yeah, and those means have to make sense within D&D.
Yeah. A thieves guild needs fences and informants.
Exactly.
Maybe some corrupt officials.
Exactly. And on the flip side, a noble house.
Oh, yeah. They need land influence.
Exactly. They need the land, the influence, the money to get what they want.
Yeah.
And then there's the leadership. The article is very adamant about leaders shouldn't just be stat blocks.
Right.
They need to have personalities.
Right.
They say fierce or wise, but also relatable and unpredictable.
That's a good point.
Maybe you have a beholder running the Wizards Guild.
Okay.
But that beholder also collects stamps.
That's great.
Or loves goblin poetry. Give them something to latch onto.
I love that.
Make them feel real.
Yeah, it makes the leaders feel real.
Yeah.
And it gives the players something that they can interact with.
Exactly.
On a personal level instead of just treating them as an obstacle.
Exactly. And it plays into that next point that factions have to react to the players.
Oh, for sure.
It's a two-way street.
Right.
If players do something that helps a faction gain power, well, that faction should become more powerful.
Absolutely.
The world changes because of their actions.
It goes back to that gears in the clockwork analogy.
Yeah.
These things aren't static.
Right.
They evolve, they adapt based on pressure, internal pressure, external pressure, and the players themselves.
Exactly.
And that makes the world feel dynamic and responsive.
Right. It's not just these set pieces. They're living, breathing things.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've built these cool factions. We've made them dynamic. We've made them react to the players. But how do we actually use them in our games?
Well, the article has some great advice, and it really depends on, if you're building a brand new world.
Yeah.
Or if you're working with an existing campaign.
That's a good point. So for DMs building a world,
yeah,
the article says, use factions as foundational elements. And they give a bunch of examples in a table.
Yeah.
So really, the secret societies and hidden agendas.
Yeah, that's always fun.
So that's where my brain goes.
Yeah.
But for existing campaigns, the article suggests starting subtle.
Right.
Like maybe you have a disgruntled barkeep.
Oh, yeah.
Who's like cursing the local merchant guild.
I love that.
Seems like a small thing.
Right.
But it could be the thread that unravels the whole thing.
Exactly. It's like a little seed that you plant and you see if it grows.
And it's low effort for the DM, too. It's like...
Yeah, just drop a couple hints.
They just drop a couple hints and see what happens.
And if they bite, you can start peeling back the layers.
Right.
Introduce them to the key players. Give them opportunities to interact with the faction.
Yeah.
In a meaningful way.
And the article talks a lot about, like, these faction relationships.
Yeah.
Being nuanced. It's not just allies or enemies. It's
a spectrum.
It's a whole spectrum.
Yeah.
Like they give the example of like a druid circle and a like militant ranger group.
Okay.
And they're like, they have a common enemy, so they're allied.
But their methods clash.
Their methods clash, their ideologies are different.
Right.
It's like this underlying tension.
Totally.
That could erupt at any moment.
And what if a drought hits?
Exactly.
And they both need the same water source.
Exactly. And the players are stuck right in the middle.
Oh, that's great.
So many possibilities.
Oh, yeah.
You could have a crime lord who's secretly funding a charity.
Right.
To like boost their public image.
To look good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or like rival factions that have to work together because of some big threat.
Exactly.
It's like factions are having their own D&D campaign in the background.
They are. They're story generators.
Yeah.
They give you a constant stream of plot hooks, side quests that all tie back into the main narrative.
And the article gives this great table that's like, okay, here are all these different faction types.
Yeah.
Here are the problems they face. Here's how players get involved.
That's useful.
It is super useful. Like, what if the players discover that a merchant consortium is smuggling illegal goods? Do they expose them? Do they take a bribe?
All right.
And like look the other way?
Yeah.
And then those consequences ripple out.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so compelling. It's not just about completing a quest.
Right.
It's about making choices that have lasting consequences for the world.
Exactly. And it makes the world feel so much more real.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about factions kind of influencing the campaign as a whole.
Right.
But what about adventures that are focused on a specific faction?
Oh, yeah. The article talks about those too.
Like, for example, a classic heist.
Well, it's a classic heist.
Yeah, for a thieves guild.
Yeah. Infiltrating the vault, cracking codes, betraying your allies.
Right. It's like a whole mini campaign.
It's like Ocean's 11.
Exactly.
But in a D&D setting.
But in D&D.
Yeah.
And don't forget to tie those faction-focused adventures to the players' backstories.
Oh, that's a great point.
What if one of the players has a history with that thieves guild?
Right. Maybe they were kicked out.
Exactly. Or they owe a debt.
Yeah.
Suddenly the stakes are so much higher.
Absolutely. It becomes personal.
It becomes personal. And then it's like, okay, do they reconcile with their past?
Right.
Do they make a clean break?
Right. It's double down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so cool is like these choices that really matter.
It's all about player agency.
Yes.
Giving the players the power to make choices that have an impact.
Speaking of player agency, what if a player wants to run their own faction?
That's a fun one.
The article has some really cool ideas about that.
Yeah, they suggest things like forming a mercenary company, leading a rebel group, starting a trading company.
Right, like really leaving their mark on the world.
Exactly.
But there's a balance, right?
Yeah.
Like, the DM needs to make sure that the player-run faction
for sure
doesn't just derail the whole campaign.
Right. It can't overshadow the other players.
Exactly.
It's a collaboration.
Right.
The DM works with the players to make sure it fits into the world.
Right. And enhances the narrative.
Enhances the narrative, exactly.
Maybe they start small. You know?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this massive powerhouse right away.
They can grow organically.
They grow organically as the campaign progresses.
Maybe they start as a band of adventurers and they slowly build a reputation, attract followers.
Exactly.
Right.
And that could be a really cool way to introduce a player-run faction.
Yeah, and it gives the players that sense of ownership. Like they're building something from the ground up.
It's their legacy.
It's their legacy, exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about building factions, making them feel real and like weaving them into our campaigns, even letting players run their own. But the article also talks about something really important for the DM, and that's keeping it all manageable.
Right, because it can get overwhelming. Like as cool as factions are,
right,
you don't want them to become a burden.
Exactly. And the article gives us some great tips for streamlining things. Like we've talked about faction sheets. But they also talk about influence trackers, resource tokens, even goal charts to kind of keep it all organized.
Yeah, it's like project management for your D&D world.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's like bringing order to the chaos.
And influence trackers, like we talked about, really help you visualize who has power over who.
Right.
You can imagine a map with all the different factions, little markers for each one, and lines connecting them.
Yeah, I love it.
Showing the alliances, the rivalries, the whole web of relationships.
And like different colors for different types of relationships.
Oh, yeah.
Like a secret pact versus like open hostility.
Exactly.
It's like a living diagram of the world's politics.
It really is.
And then there are resource tokens.
Oh, yeah, those are great.
Representing wealth, manpower, magic items, political clout.
Yeah, different colors for different resources.
Exactly. So you can just see at a glance.
At a glance, you know what they have.
What they have, exactly. And the article really stresses you don't have to overcomplicate things.
No, find a system that works for you.
That works for you. Yeah, and that keeps things manageable.
Keep it simple.
And they talk about these modular mechanics.
Oh, yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, these are like pre-designed systems.
Right.
That you can plug in as needed.
So it's like having pre-built encounters, but for like faction interaction?
Exactly. Like, let's say you have a territorial dispute.
Right.
Between two factions or some political intrigue.
Yeah.
Instead of coming up with a whole new system.
Right.
Every single time you pull out your trusty modular mechanic.
Right, you just plug it in.
You plug it in and you're good to go.
So you have one for tracking influence, one for resolving conflicts.
Exactly.
One for managing resources.
And the best part is you can find these mechanics for all sorts of things.
Right.
Like how player actions can actually ripple through the faction ecosystem.
It's like a DM toolkit.
It is.
You just pick and choose what you need, adapt it to your campaign, and boom, you're good to go.
And it makes DMing easier.
Yeah, it's supposed to be fun.
It's not a chore.
Exactly. And speaking of fun, the article reminds us to scale the complexity appropriately.
Right.
Like, don't overwhelm your players with a dozen factions and all these crazy relationships right out of the gate.
Start small.
Start small.
Maybe one or two key players.
Exactly.
And let things grow organically.
Yeah. And use the player's actions as a guide.
Exactly.
If they're really into a certain faction, flesh it out more.
Give them what they want.
Give them what they want, exactly. And if they're not interested in the faction, you had big plans for...
Leave it go.
Let it go. Don't be afraid to just let it go.
It's all about adapting.
Flexibility is key. And remember, this isn't limited to D&D or fantasy.
No. This can work in any genre.
You could use it for mega corporations in cyberpunk.
Oh, yeah.
Religious orders in historical fantasy.
Rival gangs in a modern setting.
Exactly. The possibilities are endless.
Endless.
And the article even gives tips on how to translate those faction mechanics across different systems. Like, use flexible templates. Focus on the narrative impact rather than like rigid rules.
Exactly. Make it work for your game.
Exactly. So whether you're a veteran DM or just starting out, think about like the forces that shape your world.
Yeah.
The conflicts that drive your story. How can factions bring those things to life?
Give them personality.
Yeah.
Make them react to the player.
Exactly. Make them more than just names on a page.
Let them breathe.
And maybe, just maybe, one of your players will decide to start their own faction.
Oh, that's always exciting.
That's when things get really interesting.
Yeah, it's all about creating a world that feels dynamic.
Yeah.
Alive, responsive to the players.
And where their choices have real consequences.
Absolutely.
Huge thanks again to Paul Bello.
Oh, yeah, fine fellow.
That guy's a champion of the game. And of course, LitRPG Reads for the insightful article.
Always a pleasure.
Now, we want to hear from you. What's a faction you'd love to play with or against in your next campaign?
Yeah, let us know in the comments below.
We can't wait to see what you come up with.